I never imagined that one day my name would be placed next to the word hero. I was just a civilian. I worked with electrical repairs, knew the neighborhoods like the back of my hand, and thought my role in life was to fix wires, not to help hold up a country at war. But everything changed when the first siren tore through the sky of my city. From that moment on, I set my pliers aside and joined the volunteers. That's how I met Yuri, the teacher who refused to flee. He taught history in an old school whose windows had already faced too many winters. When the city began to empty, he stayed. He said abandoning the place was like tearing pages from the people's memory. He turned the classrooms into shelters for civilians. At the entrance, he hung an improvised Ukrainian flag made from blue and yellow bed sheets. I'll never forget that cloth fluttering while bombs fell not far away. It seemed to say, "No one bows here." I remember the smell of dust mixed with the coffee he still brewed for those passing by. He walked around a copy of Taras Shevchenko's poems under his arm and read passages to the children between attacks. The man seemed made of stone, but I saw in his eyes that he carried the weight of the world. One night, we stood guard together at the school's entrance. The cold cut through us, and the sound of explosions made the ground tremble. He told me, "If I have to fall, let it be here, defending my classroom, my homeland, and my students." Yuri had no weapon. His shield was knowledge. His trench, a cracked blackboard. But the impact he had was greater than that of many soldiers armed to the teeth. You see, in the midst of so much chaos, he taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It's pressing forward even while trembling. It's holding the flag tight, even when the wind tries to tear it from your hands. After a few weeks in the most affected zones, I learned to recognize the sound of a drone by its tone, the difference between a missile and machine gun fire, and the acidic smell of smoke and burned oil. But none of that prepared me for what I found at the train station in Dnipro. There I met Natalia. She was just over 20, thin, always with her hair tied up in a messy bun and her hands stained with grease. She was a train operator, but she looked more like a commander at war on rails. She didn't wear a military uniform, but her presence commanded respect. She knew the lines, the schedules, and the shortcuts like no one else. And she used that knowledge to transport the wounded, mothers with babies, the elderly, and sometimes even disguised soldiers out of danger zones. While the country shattered into pieces, she kept her train as a moving sanctuary. I rode with her for 3 nights. We slept standing up when we could. The cabin light stayed off, and sounds were muffled with blankets. The only sound that dared break the silence was a radio, where she received last-minute coordinates about safe zones. What marked me most was when she hit the emergency brake to save a boy standing alone by the tracks. He couldn't have been older than 7, carrying a backpack filled with toys and the gaze of someone who had seen too much. Natalia ran to him, picked him up, and said simply, "Now you're home." During bombings, she kept her eyes on the rails, ears on the radio, and heart on the people. She never complained, never hesitated, just kept going, in silence. It was as if every meter of track was a stitch mending the pieces of a broken country. She was the needle, and we, the passengers lucky enough to cross her path, with a patched fabric of a nation that refuses to be torn apart. From Dnipro, I was sent to a small village near Kharkiv. The city had already been partially evacuated, but some residents insisted on staying. That's where I met Mikola, a gray-haired man, hunched by time, with eyes that burned like fire beneath the snow. He was 68 years old, with a raspy voice from smoking too much. What caught my attention was that, instead of fleeing, he organized his neighbors like the commander of a medieval fortress. On the main street, he led the construction of barricades with sandbags, broken doors, and anything that could serve as a barrier. He wore a whistle around his neck and assigned tasks as if each neighbor were a soldier in the Ukrainian army. When I arrived with supplies, he looked me up and down and said, "You look like someone who still knows how to use your hands. Go reinforce the south entrance." There, I stopped being a volunteer and became part of his people. Our mornings began with the sound of hammers and saws. At night, distant attacks became the soundtrack of our improvised resistance. Mikola moved between houses with an old radio in hand, warning of enemy movement, and always carried a notebook where he wrote the name of every living resident. One cold night, I sat beside him near a makeshift fire. He held an old photograph of himself in Soviet Army uniform. "I served once," he said, "but now I fight for something greater. My grandchildren. They're not here, but if I fall, I want them to know their grandfather never knelt." I never forgot those words. There stood a man who, even with worn-out knees, was a foundation of an entire town. He taught me that strength isn't in the arms, it's in conviction. That courage doesn't have an age, only purpose. There was a stretch of road between Mykolaiv and Odessa that few dared to cross, a red zone, ravaged by bombings, with limited access even for the military. That's where I heard about Andrei, a doctor who had set up a medical post inside one of the only buildings still standing, a partially destroyed church where stained glass windows no longer existed and the altar was covered in dust and dried blood. I arrived there on a gray morning with a backpack full of painkillers, gauze, and morphine. Andrei greeted me with a firm handshake, his hands stained with blood and his eyes red from sleepless nights. He was a surgeon, had worked for years in a hospital in the capital, but now his operating room was the cold stone floor of that church nave. The smell inside was a mix of metal, expired disinfectant, and faith. The stretchers were doors torn from destroyed homes. Scalpels were sharpened with stone. Nothing was wasted. Power came from a shaky generator that roared like a wounded beast. Still, the man operated as if in a state-of-the-art facility. I watched him save the life of a soldier with a chest wound using only tweezers, fishing line, and a flashlight strapped to his forehead. The soldier screamed but didn't pass out. The doctor didn't blink, and I held the soldier's shoulders while whispering prayers. Not because I was taught to, but because, in that moment, it was all I could do. At night, when fighting grew closer, Andrei would kneel where the altar used to be and whisper something. I never asked what. I had the feeling he was speaking to those he couldn't save on that sacred floor. That place taught me that a scalpel can be more powerful than a rifle, not to kill, but to defy death, and that even when everything becomes rubble, someone will always rise to rebuild, starting with the heart of a stranger. After weeks going from village to village, carrying stories like scars on my chest, I arrived in a small town near Zaporizhia. There wasn't much left, just echoes of a life that no longer existed, empty stores, broken lampposts, and the hollow eyes of those left behind. That's where I met Helena, a seamstress with a calm voice and quick hands. She had lost her husband in the early days of the invasion. He was a volunteer, like me. He died trying to deliver medicine to a besieged school. She didn't cry when talking about it. She simply returned to her sewing machine, miraculously still intact, and said, "If I can't hold him anymore, I can protect others like him." She turned her small shop into a sanctuary of needles, fabric, and hope. She stitched tactical vests from whatever she could find, tarp scraps, old upholstery, reinforced jeans. Nothing was thrown away. Her hands were quick and precise, as if each stitch were a silent prayer. Beside her, she created a space where neighborhood women made camouflage nets from old clothes. It was almost poetic, remnants of peaceful times now protecting men on the front lines. At night, the sound of her sewing machine became a song of resistance. Helena made me a vest. It wasn't pretty or light, but when I wore it, I felt like I was carrying the love of an entire nation on my chest. It was more than protection. It was a symbol. Before I left, she handed me a small hand-stitch patch that read, "Come back alive." I tucked it into my backpack between maps and medicine. It's still there. She didn't wield weapons, but she armed men with courage and resolve. And if there's a kind of strength the enemy will never be able to measure, it's that. By February, I arrived in Kiev, and the nighttime bombings had become almost routine. I had learned to sleep through sirens, to eat with metallic taste in my mouth, to live among rubble. It was there beneath the tracks in the abandoned subway that I found perhaps the quietest of heroes, Danilo, a young musician who never let go of his guitar. The shelter was dark, damp, and heavy with silence. Entire families lived there like shadows, hidden from the world, breathing fear like air. Danilo didn't speak much, but his presence was constant. Every night, He sat in a corner and played gentle chords that cut to the cold like an invisible blanket. It wasn't party music. It was soul music, old folk songs, laments, and sometimes even a psalm recited between chords with a soft, steady voice, like someone asking the heavens for strength to survive another night. I saw children approach him as if they were approaching the light. I saw mothers cry in silence as he played, and I saw soldiers covered in mud and blood close their eyes for just a moment, just to remember they were still human. Danilo told me he never wanted to fight with weapons. He said his mission was different, to keep hope alive where no one else dared to breathe. If the heart stops beating, the body dies. If hope dies, the homeland dies, he said. In that underground, where every step echoed between concrete and fear, he was a pulse. And as strange as it sounds, it was there, in that darkness filled with strings and faith, that I truly understood what resistance meant. These are just some of the lives that crossed my path. Ordinary people who became invisible walls in the middle of chaos. None of them wore a uniform at first. None expected to be called to the front lines. But they all answered, not with words, but with action. When I think of the war, I don't just remember the explosions, the smoke, or the muffled sound of distant gunfire. I remember the smell of Yuri's coffee, the echo of Mikola's whistle between alleyways, Helena's hands marked by thread and grief, and Danilo's music in the dark. I remember Natalia's eyes fixed on rails, and Andri's scalpel glinting under a headlamp amidst blood and dust. A hero is not someone who seeks war. It's someone who chooses to protect, even when they could run. Someone who extends a hand when all they have left is their own courage. I was just a volunteer, but walking among these souls, I was forged by them. And today, I carry within me each of those faces, each anonymous act of bravery that held up the country when everything seemed about to collapse. If one day someone asks me where I found the true strength of Ukraine, I will not hesitate to say, it lies in civilians, in invisible ones, in those who stay standing, even when the world insists on falling.